evening and welcome to Biz in Focus. This evening my guest is a very interesting individual. He's hailing from Australia. He is a professor of social media and new media. He is well known for his expertise in the field of law, media law and also ethics. A very good evening and welcome to the show, Professor Pearson. Professor Pearson, starting off, tell us a little bit about your background and what you are specialized in which areas?
Yes, well, I'm a professor of journalism and social media, and my background is as a journalist. I was a working newspaper journalist in suburban and regional newspapers, as well as on our national daily newspaper, The Australian, before I went into teaching journalism and got my qualifications up to doctoral level in the areas of media law and ethics. So I specialise in both the risk and regulation of media and social media.
What brought you to Sri Lanka this time around, Professor? I believe this is your first visit to the island. And what brought you to Sri Lanka?
I came to Sri Lanka for two reasons. One is professionally. I've been collaborating with a colleague here in Sri Lanka on a media ethics project. And as part of that, I was asked to address the Sri Lankan Press Council and to do some other media interviews like this one. But also for personal reasons, my wife and I will be travelling through Sri Lanka after my business engagements.
Media ethics is a very subjective word in the eyes of media establishments and even the government per se. What is the real definition of media ethics, Professor, in your opinion?
Well, ethics apply to all of us, even at a very personal, moral level. Ethics is really a professional application of what is the right or the wrong thing to do. In journalism, for media ethics, there's a long tradition of journalism ethical codes covering the behaviour of journalists across a whole range of things, respecting truth and accuracy, certain rules on what not to do, invade people's privacy, or take corrupt earnings from your work, those sorts of things. So, for journalists, ethics has always been a set of rules. These days, with so many more people practicing journalism, and in social media, in citizen journalism, people don't always have a journalism background. So ethics becomes a much more difficult concept because they don't necessarily have a code of ethics to abide by.
Professor, many countries in the subcontinent are looking at establishing media ethics bodies under the intervention of respective governments. Discussions are afoot even in Sri Lanka at the moment about creating a particular body to govern media institutions. Is that the way forward for a democracy?
It's a very important question, and it's being dealt with in many other countries. There's a very fine line between ethics, which implies self-regulation, and professional bodies organising their own affairs, a very fine line between that and government intervention and censorship of the media. So we have to be very careful if we're talking about ethical bodies actually having any licensing or censoring powers over the media. In the countries where that sort of system works best, the democracies where it works best, is where such self-governing bodies are able to control their own ethical boundaries without having government funding or intervention.
Professor, we speak about media ethics. What sort of activities and what is the code of conduct for journalists in today's day and age when it's reporting, when it's doing something for the betterment of the public? Well, where does media ethics come into play?
This is a very good question. You see, journalism associations have their own codes of ethics, which are these guiding rules, and they are excellent documents. As I said a moment ago, they cover all of those basic rules of what to do or not to do, as well as normally some foundational statements about fair and accurate reporting being essential to a democracy. All of that's very good, but it also comes back to a person's own moral code. And where do they get this moral code? Because a journalist operating under a code of ethics can normally argue that there is a public interest as to why they should do or not do something. But it's their moral code, their inner conscience, that determines whether they would then actually do that thing or not. So if I take, for example, someone in a terrible state of grief, should we interview that person if they are grieving, if they've just lost someone close to them? Is it fair to intrude upon them and conduct the interview? Well, a code of ethics would say we should not intrude upon someone's grief unless it's absolutely essential in the public interest. Now that then puts back to the
How do you define that, Professor?
That's right. Public interest is so difficult to define. It comes down to court decisions sometimes as to what is in the public interest or not, but also at a personal level one has to decide whether there is some greater public interest to be served by this act that might be otherwise an immoral kind of act. And that is the hardest part for journalists facing those sorts of decisions. But it's unless there is something severely illegal about it that the rest of the society would never be allowed to do, it's not something that governments should intrude into. Journalists and their own professional associations should be able to resolve malpractice in this area.
Professor, what sort of system or mechanism is adopted in Australia in terms of media ethics?
In Australia we have a National Journalists Union and it has its own Australian Journalists Code of Ethics. Now in addition to that, most of the different publishing houses have in-house codes of practice. And these cover things like not being discriminatory in your reporting, not using deceptive means to obtain an interview, basically being fair and accurate in your reporting. We also have various codes that are applied by our Press Council and by our Broadcasting Authority. So any journalist in Australia at any time is working within the bounds of media law, as well as sometimes 2 or 3 different codes of ethics or codes of conduct.
Professor, let's talk about social media. What is the role of social media and how must media organizations resort to social media? Is TV and radio a dying trend?
Well, there are many questions you have here, and coming to the social media part of it first, social media is clearly still an immature medium. It's only been around for a little more than 10 years, and in many parts of the world, much less time than that. So we are still grappling with what social media means in its relationship with the mainstream media. So different media organisations have tried all sorts of techniques to engage with their communities through social media. Some have been more successful than others. In my country, for example, Twitter as a social medium has become a communication of currency amongst journalists themselves. Journalists communicate with each other on Twitter more so than in most other forms. The extent to which they engage with the public, though, has changed because social media is very much social. And it's people sharing things with each other, whereas traditional media was always about getting the story, the media organisation owning the story, and then delivering it to an audience. Well, now the audience can share, they are part of the story, they engage, and sometimes they're getting their story from somewhere other than the mainstream media. Now,
and the story could also be wrong.
What we have in this modern era, you ask whether radio and television are dying media. Well, we can also ask whether print is a dying medium. And the answer to those questions varies a great deal across different countries and across different media markets. So in some specialised fields, for example in finance, the print media is still quite strong in Western countries. In developing nations where literacy is still on the increase, newspapers are in some countries still growing in their circulation. So we get a lot of variation there. All media seem to be able to adapt, even though some of them shrink over time. And just because we have this new medium on the block, social media, does not mean that the others necessarily die, but what it represents is a major new challenge for all of those existing media, and unless they adapt to that challenge, they will die. But perhaps not all of them. Some will adapt and grow.
Professor, when it comes to media ethics and social media, there's always a parallel between the two, because there's always a dark side or a grey side to social media as well. People being bullied, the wrong information being out, creation of false accounts, so on and so forth. How do you draw a parallel between media ethics and reporting on social media, and even making a post on social media for public knowledge?
Well, one of the things that I teach and write about is the fact that with social media, with media ethics and law, it used to be quite simple. It was mainly journalists who had to learn about that and worry about that. They had their own code of ethics and they learned about media law before they became a journalist. Now with social media, everybody is a publisher. And people don't necessarily realise that. They don't realise that once they post a tweet or a Facebook post or an Instagram post, they are actually publishers. They're publishing something for all the world to see. And they are coming under all of those same laws that journalists have had to deal with. As far as the ethics goes, the ethical principles also apply, but people don't necessarily know that. They don't identify as journalists, so why should they follow a journalist's code of ethics? It comes back, as I was saying earlier, to their individual moral compass. And this is something that's certainly lacking in many societies, because in Western societies there's been a move away from traditional religions, and we've often drawn upon religion for our family and individual moral compass. So for societies where religion is still quite a strong element, I would suggest that it's very good to be attuned with whatever is your own religious moral compass, whether that is in Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, whatever that happens to be, because that is the secret to finding the acceptable moral code. And from my experience, most of those main religions actually have a fairly common moral compass that can guide our moral decision making.
First, you speak about the moral compass. However, let's take a look at those who want to disrupt the social media space. What role do you see the governments playing, respective governments playing, in order to eliminate such disruptors from the social media space and giving people the right opportunity to report or publish material that they wish to?
Well, the first thing I would say is that as we get new technologies, I don't think we need a whole suite of new laws. There are already far too many laws restricting free expression in most countries. I know that in Sri Lanka, for example, free expression and a free press is actually protected under your constitution. And so there should be a minimum number of laws that would impinge upon free expression or a free media. You do need some laws to stop people saying terrible things about each other, and these would apply equally in social media as they do to the mainstream media. But I think what you need more of across any society is better media literacy and understanding about what is right and wrong in social media. Because it's a new medium, not everybody understands the etiquette, the good manners, the damage that can be done through poor practice. And I think this is the place that we need to address it. We need better educational campaigns around social media. more public education around responsible use of social media, just as we would train a journalist to use their medium responsibly.
Social media is banned, as you correctly pointed out, in many countries, Professor. Let's take China for an example. Let's take Turkmenistan for an example, which boasts of being neutral. However, countries like Sri Lanka, 7 years following the end of the conflict, in a country like Sri Lanka, how do you see social media playing a bigger or better role in nurturing the students' life, entrepreneurial skills? How do you see social media really coming into play 7 years following an end of a conflict in a country like Sri Lanka?
Well, Sri Lanka has all sorts of individual idiosyncrasies from its historical background, its politics. I am not an expert in Sri Lankan politics or history, but my expertise tells me that with social media, it can be used like any medium for good or evil in all sorts of ways. It is good in a democracy to have people talking about politics, important events in the community, and it's good to encourage that discussion. We have a marketplace of ideas. With social media, for the first time in history, there is a medium where everybody has access to that marketplace of ideas, everybody who has access to a device. And that can be a wonderful force for social good. And it would be good to see ways that the government in any country, including Sri Lanka, can encourage responsible use so that the public maximises the benefits of social media rather than moving to shut down certain media, to place firewalls around it, to box it in, because the experience generally shows that the community will talk about these things anyway, and social media provides a way that they can do it, and it's transparent, people can see what each other are saying, and that can only be for the good.
Professor, when it comes to the future of social media, where do you see social media really heading? And how can people get attuned to the systems and mechanisms that would be brought out by social media? It seems that only a certain section of the people, let's take Facebook for an example, they dominate the space as far as social media is concerned. Where do you see the future really heading?
Well, I've always been reluctant to predict the future. One of the greatest futurists in recent decades was Arthur C. Clarke, who lived in Sri Lanka. And I know that back in around 1974, he predicted the sort of communication we have now. He said, by this stage we would all have personal devices where we're placing food and food orders and theatre bookings. He actually predicted all of this and did a great job of it. My own view, looking at the way things are developing, is that at present we have some emerging problems with ownership of social media platforms. While social media is a wonderful medium to communicate on, the problem with it is that it is dominated by globalised multinational corporations that own the platforms, and also that governments are using it as a method of surveillance to clamp down on journalism and social dissent. So these are big problems that have to be resolved. As far as the optimistic future of social media, I can see an era where virtual reality is accompanying social media, and I don't think it's very far away where we will be able to engage with social media, our family, friends, colleagues, very intuitively, rather than having to use a telephone device and all be zombies with our heads bent down using our telephones. There will be more intuitive devices where we are able to use voice or facial commands to be able to access our social networks, to be able to, whether it's through some glass mechanism or some attachment to our eyes, we'll be able to engage with friends and colleagues internationally with no more than the blink of an eye.
What is your message, Professor, to respective governments, to those who use social media, in terms of protecting the privacy, individuality of those who are using the social media space?
I think social media needs to be matched with human rights frameworks. There are internationally accepted standards to do with fundamental human rights, and I think this can equally be applied to social media. Everyone has a right to privacy, everyone has a right to free expression, everyone has a right to natural justice and to not having the state watch them and control their activities. And all of these can be applied very sensibly to social media, so that social media just becomes a part of life and is not abused by governments for their own ends, whether they be positive ends or negative ends like corruption and even worse, devices used by autocracies.
Can people survive without social media, Professor?
I think history has shown people can survive very well without any medium. And I try to survive without social media, at least for certain periods of a day, and sometimes for days on end. Life can be much happier without all of these disruptions. I would much prefer to sit down with my grandchildren and cuddle them, play with them, than speak with them on FaceTime or send them a message. The human interaction is the most important interaction we have, and I would much prefer the natural interaction than a social media one.
Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us this evening. Human interaction is the most important component in anyone's life. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us this evening on Biz In Focus.
Thank you for the honor.
Pleasure to have you on board today.
Thank you.